Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the Spring 2019 Community Outreach Webinar Series. Today's webinar is entitled Civil Rights in the Language Access Planning. My name is Lillian Zuniga, and I am the Program Manager for the Office of Health Equity. I coordinate the Language Access Services for the Public Health Division at the Wyoming Department of Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to assist organizations on how to comply with federal laws and providing appropriate language access services. Before we get started, I would like to provide a few housekeeping notes. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, and the last 15 minutes is for question and answers. We were asked via the phone during the question and answer section. And we will also provide a brief assessment afterwards at the end of the webinar, so you can encourage you to complete and help us improve the webinars and get suggestions for topics. And now I'd like to welcome Nora. She is a member of the Wyoming State Network for Language Access, and that's WNSLA for short. And she helped coordinate this webinar along with Cindy Castillo. I'd like to thank both of them for their help. And go ahead, Nora, take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Nora Gross. I'm an interpreter and translator located in Casper, Wyoming. So can you change the slide, please?
Okay, give me a second.
Wyoming State Network for Language Access, WNSLA, is a community of legal and healthcare professionals, law enforcement personnel, interpreters, translators, service providers, advocates, and community members dedicated to ensure that Wyoming local providers and state agencies understand and comply with the language access provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We started 2 years ago, and we have a list of interpreters in Wyoming available for you guys to access. I already put several links in the chat box, so you guys can go there and check for different things I'm gonna mention here. So you can have, you have there the link to access the database of interpreters in Wyoming. We also have a Facebook page, and so if you go and check on Facebook, you can find us. Can you change this slide, please? Today, we're gonna be having, we're gonna be talking about, this is the second webinar of a series of 3 about language access. And if you missed the first one, you can have access to that one, and we have a link here and also in the chat. So it's on the Office of Health Equity website, but also it's on YouTube. So I provided both options there for you to access. Today we're going to be talking about language access planning, and it's the session number 2. And in about a week or so, you will be able to have access to the recording for this as well. The third and last webinar will be on May 22nd, and that one will be about Beyond LEP, effectively communicating with individuals with disabilities. And if you want, there's the to be able to register, there's the link here too. You can change now. The first week of June, we're going to have in Casper a training for interpreters, and this is the only national community interpreting training in the United States. So it's very exciting to have this happening in Wyoming, and I want to thank the Office of Health Equity for putting together this training. This type of training doesn't happen very often in Wyoming, so it's a great opportunity for people who currently work as interpreters and just want to improve their skills, or for people who want to start working as interpreters. The Office of Health Equity is offering in this moment a scholarship and an early bird discount for the first participants that will register before May 1st. The cost is only $360. plus $75 per each language proficiency assessment. That normally you will have to take two, one in English and one in the other language that you're going to interpret to. After May 1st, there will be the full cost. That will be $680 plus the assessments. Who is a good candidate for this training? So staff interpreters that you currently have, bilingual staff with interpreting duties, contract interpreters, freelancers, legal interpreters, education, social services, and community services interpreters, anybody that wants to start doing interpretations, and also coordinators of language access plans. That are the people that oversee the interpreters, and they will have the opportunity to learn how to work with an interpreter and how to set goals for the language access plans in their company. During the course, the participants will be tested for language proficiency to receive a certificate. And also they will understand the interpreting profession. They will learn basic protocols, national ethics, and performance assessments. They will practice protocols and skills that are key for this profession, and they will acquire decision-making tools. They will learn positioning, message transfer, memory, and note-taking strategies by doing group exercises, role plays, and other type of activities. Understand the strategic mediation, develop a professional identity, and understand the interpreter's role. And one of the most important things in this training is the networking. You will learn from other interpreters and other people involved in this industry and build relationships. So there's a link here also to register for the course, and it's the same thing, it's on the chat box, so you can access that information. Now we're gonna go ahead with the poll, Lillian. So if you guys could please answer these 3 questions. Here we have the results now.
So it looks like we have local public health is the big number 1 on the calls, and interpreting services is being used most is the telephone. And yes, looks like their interpreters have had professional development. So I'm going to end that poll now.
Okay, you can change the slide now. So I want to introduce today's speaker. It's Ian Ships. He is a supervisor investigator for the Office of Civil Rights and from the Department of Health and Human Services. Welcome, Ian, and thank you very much for spending your time with us. Ian?
Let me check, see if his phone is muted. It might be. I'll need to unmute him. Are you there, Ian?
I am here.
Okay, great. And I thought I stopped sharing my slides, so you can go ahead and have yours up. There you go.
Sorry about that quick little glitch. Hopefully we won't have to delay any further. Sorry for that. I am here. Thank you for introducing me, Nora. And thank you all for attending this second presentation of this webinar series. And as Nora mentioned, we are going to talk today more about language access planning. Just to sort of recap, though, we will, well, right now, I'll sort of kind of recap what we did or what we discussed in the first presentation in the series. I gave a brief little overview of the Office for Civil Rights where I work. We talked a little bit about what the Office for Civil Rights does. We spoke a little bit about the laws that we enforce that require covered healthcare providers to ensure effective communication with limited English proficient or LEP individuals. The big takeaway of the first presentation was, again, focusing on that legal requirement for providers to ensure effective communication with LEP individuals by providing interpreter services and translation services free of charge to those individuals, regardless of their immigration status. We briefly mentioned the distinction between oral language interpreter services versus written language translation services. And if there are any questions about that stuff that we talked about last time that are still lingering, we can address those at that point at the end of this presentation during the question Q&A period. Today we're going to talk about best practices, really. So last time was like, what is the what? Today we're going to talk about best practices or the how of how providers should go about providing these language access services to LEP individuals. Again, we'll talk about language access plans versus language assistance services. They're really not very different, but they're related, they encompass one another. We'll discuss interpreter competency to a degree, and then also whether it's appropriate for bilingual staff to serve as interpreters. Real quickly, though, before we get to the meat of the material, I'm just going to go through a real quick summary of the stuff we talked about last time with respect to the Office for Civil Rights. Again, we're the civil rights enforcement part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so we're a federal enforcement agency. We do lots of things, including providing technical assistance and public outreach, just like I'm doing today for you all. When we get a complaint, we serve as a fact-finding entity that receives the complaint, investigates it, and determines whether or not there was any discrimination based on the allegations that we investigated and the evidence that we collected. And if there was, we make sure that those entities take any corrective actions that they need to. And then if they don't cooperate with that requirement, then we may begin terminating the federal financial assistance that we provide, that HHS provides to those providers. Again, real quickly, yes, I'm in the Denver regional office. We're located, of course, downtown Denver. In our regional office, the states that we serve include Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. We have other regional offices throughout the country. And one question that came up last time related, or a couple of questions, I think, related to schools. And I just wanted to let everyone know now, and I think I did then, but again, there are other federal departments that have their own sort of offices for civil rights. Those do include the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They enforce federal civil rights laws, as does the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They have a Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Division that enforces federal civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination. And there are a number of others, but those are the ones that we're most compared with or compared to. So this is a little bit more about OCR. Again, who must comply with these laws that require providers to provide LEP individuals with interpreter and translation services. Again, it's those folks, those providers who receive federal financial assistance from us, from our department at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We talked a little bit about what that funding, federal funding, looks like and the forms that it comes in. This slide sort of summarizes that. Again, it's any provider that accepts CHIP or Medicare, Medicaid or Medicare Parts A, C, or D. Usually the entities that receive this type of funding from us include state, county departments of human services, public health services, public health entities. It also includes health plans that are offered on the insurance exchanges or the marketplaces, also hospitals. And then we'll move on from there. This is, again, just sort of a recap. Again, if there are questions about who must comply with these laws that require language assistance services, we can talk about that during the Q&A portion. But getting into really what we were here to talk about again, this is sort of a summary, this first bullet, about the last webinar, the last presentation in the series, where we just essentially talked about how that the providers must make sure that they provide meaningful access, that that's what the laws require, that these providers provide meaningful access to LEP individuals who are eligible and also likely to be encountered in the health programs and activities that are offered. This requires the provision of interpreter services and or written translation services. The providers are expected to offer qualified interpreter services when oral interpretation is the best, most reasonable step to provide that individual with meaningful access to the healthcare and or other benefits and services that the provider offers. And then where those services are required, or where interpreter services are required, providers should make sure that they're given free of charge to the patient or the companion who needs them, and also that they're provided in a timely manner. We'll talk about a little bit the timeliness factor in a second. And again, I would just point out that these services are required to be provided regardless of the patient and or the companion's immigration status. So these are some things that providers are not allowed to do with respect to the provision of, or I guess, meaningful access and effective communication for LEP individuals. So the provider can't require that the individual, the patient or the companion who needs language access to provide his or her own interpreter. The provider can't rely on a minor to interpret, with one exception we'll talk about, and that's in the context of an emergency. Providers should not or cannot rely on interpreters that the individual prefers when the provider has some questions or concerns about that person being competent or keeping information confidential, or any other kinds of concerns. Providers should not or cannot rely on unqualified bilingual staff to serve as interpreters because they are not trained in the role of an interpreter, and we're going to talk about that in a few slides, what that role is. And then also, providers can use what is commonly referred to as video remote interpreting services. However, the quality of that video remote interpreting service must be high quality. It cannot be low quality and effectively deny or delay the provision of care. So there's not really much of a distinction between a language. I guess the main distinction between language assistance services and language access plans is that those language assistance services are encompassed or included within a provider's a language access plan. So again, these are best practices, and instituting these practices will not guarantee compliance with Title VI and Section 1557 with respect to providing interpreter services and translation services for LEP individuals, but it's going to make sure that you're at least on the right path and doing what's supposed to happen. First, we are going to talk about language access plans. So again, this is a best practice that a provider, an organization should have a language access plan. And what we have found that works best through our investigations are plans that regularly assess the needs of the patient populations that they serve. One way to find that information, of course, is just through your anecdotal appointments and or visits or encounters. Of course, you can also refer to the U.S. Census. They have a website that includes demographic information for all states, as well as certain jurisdictions within states. So that's a good resource to figure out, what kinds of populations do we serve or have the potential to serve, and what kinds of interpreters, what kinds of languages do we need to be able to accommodate. That also kind of gets to this next bullet. In the previous presentation of the webinar series, on one of the resources slides, there was that I Speak language identification cards that were in a variety of different languages that can be offered for people who come into your business, your practice, your organization, so that if they are LEP, they can hopefully find their specific language, identify it, and that way let you and your staff know the language that the interpreter needs to be able to communicate in, so that you can provide the appropriate care and access to those folks who need the services, the interpretive services. Policies and procedures, I can't emphasize that one enough, though they're not necessarily mandated by Title VI in Section 1557. It's certainly a best practice. These policies and procedures should be in writing, either a hard copy or electronic or both. It should basically explain your organization's processes for providing language assistance services, right? So, it should explain who staff contacts for scheduling an interpreter. It should explain whether the organization documents the needs of an interpreter in the patient's medical record or other kind of documented record for that individual. It should also, the policies and procedures should address the effectiveness of the interpreter, perhaps after the visit is over, when the interpreter has provided the interpreting services. It should address what the process is for providing LAP patients with accurately translated documents. And again, documents that typically would need to be translated are those documents that are typically handed out to English-speaking individuals, like intake forms when they're there for their first visits. Different notices, for example, like HIPAA privacy notices, should be available in translated versions. Discharge instructions should be available for those LEP individuals in their languages. And then prescription instructions, those kinds of things. There's certainly, that's not a comprehensive list, but it's certainly one that you can kind of have the idea of the types of things that should be translated. So again, these policies and procedures should document how all of this is supposed to happen for your particular organization and who's in charge of it. Maybe your organization assigns the duty or a person with the title of the language access coordinator. We've seen, and usually for larger entities, that a language access coordinator is really helpful and does make a difference with respect to ensuring effective communication with LAP individuals. So then, providing notice of language assistance services. So this bullet on here about this notice, when we talk about that as a best practice, the example is making sure that in your organization, in a lobby or a waiting area, physically in a conspicuous location where folks can see that there is an availability for language assistance services. And obviously, the folks who might need those services may not be able to read the notice if it's only in English and they don't read English. So it's a good idea to have those notices posted in your lobby or waiting areas in the most commonly encountered languages that you guys that are in your jurisdictions or your localities. Staff training is huge. It's very important. I could probably guarantee you that a number of the complaints that we have received in our office alleging that a provider has failed to ensure effective communication because they didn't have interpreters or translated materials, that a number of those complaints we probably wouldn't have received had the organization effectively trained its staff on its language access plan, and in particular on those policies and procedures that I talked about a few seconds ago. Training, I cannot emphasize it enough. And then, of course, just monitoring the effectiveness of the program or your language access plan. Is it working? What needs to be tweaked? I mean, bottom line is the language access plan, and again, as a best practice, is helping, is something that you would put in place so that you as an organization know what you need as far as being able to provide these language assistance services, interpreter services, translation services. So knowing what you need, getting and then having what you need, and then making sure that your staff knows how to implement that language access plan and knows how to initiate language assistance services for those LAP folks who need them. And though it's not on a bullet on this slide, it's really related to this. I think I can't emphasize enough the importance for providers or other organizations to document anything and everything as far as your efforts are concerned. Document your written policies and procedures, of course. Document the training that your staff gets or that you provide to your staff regarding how you're implementing this plan. Document in the medical record that an interpreter came for this LAP patient and how the visit went, and even using some sort of, or documenting even the effectiveness or the apparent effectiveness of the interpretation is a great idea. So these are some language assistance services that are often included or a part of language access plans. So of course we talk about bilingual staff, and they are appropriate, again, provided that they've been credentialed or are qualified interpreters. They're not just they're just not that, and it's not that they're just able to speak in English in the target language, because there's more to it. Bilingual staff are a great resource as long as they're qualified. Staff interpreters, of course, if your organization is fortunate enough to have the ability to staff people in your office to solely serve as interpreters, that would be fantastic. I don't think that's all that realistic in a lot of cases, but that's just one, again, option for a language assistance service. Contractors, of course, are available. There are for-profit and nonprofit interpreter services available for providers to use. Of course, there are telephone lines and video teleconferencing. Video teleconferencing refers to the video remote interpretive services that I mentioned earlier. As long as those things work well without any glitches, then those are sufficient. And then, of course, community volunteers. Cindy Castillo, who's a part of this group who put this webinar series together, I believe is a member of such a community volunteer group in the Jackson, Wyoming area, and they serve a vital role in that community. So check your own communities. Perhaps that Jackson Community Volunteer Service 122 may be available for those of you who may not even be in Jackson. So with that said, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet that OCR does, the Office for Civil Rights does, maybe I mentioned it, but haven't at all gotten into detail about it, is the fact that not only do we enforce federal civil rights laws, such as Title VI and Section 1557, but we also enforce HIPAA privacy laws. And so most likely, the privacy rule, or HIPAA, would consider a number of these things listed here on this slide as a business associate for a provider who must comply with, so if there's a provider that has to comply with HIPAA and they utilize any of these services, it's possible or even likely that these folks would meet the definition of what's called a business associate. And so what a business associate is under HIPAA, it's an organization that performs a function for that covered entity or for the provider that creates, receives, maintains, or transmits protected health information on behalf of the provider. So obviously, when you have, let's say, a contractor or a phone service who helps you with your interpreter services, the interpreter who's meeting with the patient and or the provider or the client and someone else in the organization, if there is health information at all being discussed, then of course that's protected health information that would also fall under the protections of HIPAA. And so what HIPAA requires providers to do is, if they use in that sort of scenario that I described, those providers must engage in what's called a business associate agreement between itself and the interpreter services. One of the resource slides at the end of this presentation, I've included a link to our website that will take you to a page that talks about business associate agreements, so that if you aren't sure what they are or how to use them or what to do, that's a great reference for guidance and technical assistance for you all. Again, these are great entities to use for interpretive services, and if you do, just make sure that you have a business associate agreement in place, because the interpreters will come into contact with sensitive health information that should be protected. So when you are selecting the language assistance services that you provide, or that you will provide, there's some things that you really want to make sure that you take into account. And one is the competency of the interpreters or the service that you've selected or are likely to select. Do they do a good job? Are they good interpreters? And it may not be that easy for you to tell, but again, documenting those interactions between the interpreters and your providers should sort of give you an idea as to whether you feel the competency of those interpreters is up to par. And then timeliness. We'll talk about both of these ideas in the next couple of slides, but just know that for now, until we get to that slide, that interpreter services must be provided in a timely fashion. And so there, again, the laws just require what must happen, and these are our best practices, but when it comes to providing services, competency and timeliness are not necessarily best practices, they are required. But you all do have the ability and the flexibility to pick and choose which services are best for you and your populations you serve and your budgets and everything else that you have to take into account. So when we talk about interpreter competency, this is what we're referring to. And so I'm going to kind of read through these bullets, but it's also just really important to emphasize that these interpreters, services, they must demonstrate proficiency in both English and the target language or the other language. The interpreters or the services must demonstrate the knowledge of specialized terms or concepts. And in our work in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, in particular, it's important for well, in your lines of work as well, that the interpreters be able to know how to interpret medical terminology in particular, and then any other sort of industry-specific, health industry, public health specific terminology that you all would use on a normal basis. It must also demonstrate an understanding of the need for confidentiality and impartiality. I kind of mentioned the confidentiality piece a little bit with respect to HIPAA and making sure that these communications, though with an interpreter, are kept private and as confidential as possible. And then, of course, the main thing really, and this kind of goes to whether or not a bilingual staff member is a good option or a language assistance resource for an interpreter, is that those folks who are interpreting understand their role as an interpreter. And so some of that information or some of the training that Nora mentioned that's happening in Casper in June will touch a lot on obviously what the role of an interpreter is and what it should be. So just to sort of give you an idea of what that might entail or what the handbook refers to with respect to that role. So what they do is they support communicative autonomy of the parties for which they're interpreting. They help maintain their responsibility, or they maintain that responsibility of interpreting for both parties and to control their own communication. And so this is what they have to do in doing that. They must observe confidentiality, what that aspect of communication plays into the back and forth, the dialogue. They need to strive for accuracy, display impartiality, ensure transparency. They need to promote direct communication, and some of that has to do with just some of the stuff that will be covered in the training, such as positioning your bodies and physically where you're located in doing the interpreting, respecting professional boundaries, supporting intercultural communication, and then maintaining professional conduct. And there is a certain code of ethics, I believe, that where all this is entailed with respect to interpreters. But just know that's information that you'll get into in more detail if you're fortunate to be able to go to the training that's offered in June. I highly recommend that you, or bilingual staff, especially if they're not qualified yet, attend that training if they can. So getting into the timeliness piece of this, so basically it is what it sounds like, that a provider must make sure that they provide these interpretive services when they're needed, so that they don't result in an undue delay or denial of care or service. So bottom line, what this means is that the organization, the provider, must do the best they can to be as organized as possible, so that they're ready to go when someone who needs an interpreter has an appointment. That's sort of the example that I would give, is that if your organization, for example, documents an individual's need for interpretive services, that way, that would be great, so that the next time that person schedules an appointment, the fact that they need an interpreter is available in the record or somewhere else that that's pretty easy to find. And then the provider, the organization, arranges for the interpretive service, or the interpreter, to be there or to be ready to go as that appointment is supposed to happen. There's no magic time frame within which a interpreter must be provided, but again, it must happen so that it does not effectively deny the provision of care or the service or the benefit. Canceling an appointment or denying service and telling somebody to come back another time so that the interpreter can be arranged for may be, in some cases, the denial of service, in which case we might, if we were to get a complaint, have to come in and make sure that your organization is doing what it needs to do. We touched on this last time about the appropriateness for using family members and companions as interpreters. And so just getting back into that, it is okay for a patient to use an adult family member or companion to interpret for that patient with the provider. But there are a couple of caveats. So emergency situations are certainly situations where it's okay to use adult family members as interpreters. But it also, of course, might be the case that the patient really is adamant that the companion who they bring with them be the interpreter. And that is okay under the circumstances. And that's up to the provider to determine whether the circumstances that are presented should or do result in allowing the provider, or the provider being okay basically with that person serving as an interpreter. So it shouldn't be an automatic, yes, okay, this person's with you, he or she can serve as your interpreter. The provider really needs to sort of assess the situation and make sure that under those circumstances it's okay. So one thing that providers might want to take into account when considering the circumstances is the kind of information that's going to be relayed between the provider and the complainant, or the patient rather. Is there sensitive information that's going to be discussed, such as lab results, perhaps sensitive HIV status results, those kinds of things? Is that going to come out during a discussion? And if it does, but the provider's not sure that the companion should be privy to that information, then he should say, he or she should say, I'm not sure that this is a great time to have an interpreter family member. So let's use the interpreter services that we have or that we can provide to you free of charge. In any event, even if a provider does say, okay, under these circumstances, it's fine for you to have your companion serve as your interpreter, the provider should still make sure that person knows that interpreter services are available free of charge. It's just best practice to do that. And that way it might let the patient sort of have something else to consider before sort of relying on a family member, because maybe they don't really want that family member if they do think some sensitive information may come up that they don't want to have shared with the family member or the companion. So just best practice, even if it's okay in your opinion in the situation that a companion can interpret, still offer your free of charge interpreter services, even if the patient insists on the companion. And we talked a little bit about some of the risks involved with using family members and friends for interpreters. And these, again, just sort of highlight these bullets on this slide. Those folks may not necessarily be proficient in complex or medical terminology. They may not have the necessary skills and ethical training that's required to serve as an interpreter. They may not emotionally be able to handle sensitive, again, information that might be conveyed, especially children. And then those companions may either intentionally or unintentionally omit or leave stuff out that should be shared and discussed between the patient and the provider. So that's the meat of what this particular presentation for this webinar series entails. Looking ahead, we will have a third and last and final leg of this webinar series on Wednesday, May 22nd, 2019, same time. And in that one, we are also going to discuss providers' legal responsibilities for ensuring effective communication with disabled individuals or individuals with disabilities. So it's a different patient population, but similar concepts, similar ideas. We'll touch again on the specific laws that require providers to ensure effective communication with that patient population. We'll also talk about the various kinds of auxiliary aids and services that providers might use to communicate with those folks. We'll touch on a couple of other laws that OCR enforces that prohibit discrimination, and then we'll do a recap of the entire series, basically sort of discussing the do's and the don'ts of ensuring effective communication, again, with LEP individuals, and then also with individuals with disabilities. Again, here are some resource slides. This is the same resource slide that was available in the first presentation of the webinar series. And then this is the updated slide, the updated resource slide that includes the third bullet with a link to OCR's website where you all can find information about business associate agreements. Again, here is my contact information, or the contact information for the Office for Civil Rights in the Denver Regional Office. And now I'm happy to take any questions you all might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. And for our question and answer section, we have, I'm going to go ahead and if you want to raise your hand and unmute yourself, we have, if you go on the bottom where it says raise hand, you're able to raise your hand and we will be able to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and ask Ian the question. Can't see anyone, any questions. Nora, do you see anyone with questions?
I see one on the chat.
Yeah, Cindy has a question. Cynthia Castillo.
So, Ian, how do you suggest we help organizations start working on language access plans, or where have you seen organizations that have language access plans? What we seem to have going on in Wyoming is the sense of just in, as long as we have interpreters or we have translation services, that's enough. There's not this real strategic way to look at this in terms of funding and planning, even in our governmental organizations.
That's a tough question. I mean, every organization is different. So I also understand that every organization has different priorities and different resources. I don't necessarily know of a way to, educate beyond webinars like this, really, folks, or sort of advocate that they develop and implement a language access plan. Again, my office is really, in addition to just letting folks doing outreach and educating the public about what their obligations are, we investigate complaints that we get. So a lot of our work is really complaint driven, and it's not necessarily, it's more, I don't know, that's a tough question for me to answer. I'm sure there's lots of advocacy organizations that have sort of developed an advertising or marketing or communication strategy for different industries about how best to work with LEP populations in providing interpreter services. I mean, the only thing that I can tell you that we do in the Office for Civil Rights is if and when we get a complaint that does result in, the failure to provide interpreter services, and it's a fairly egregious situation or a fairly large or a high impact type situation where the result impacts a lot of people, we do post information on our websites and issue press releases. And that's kind of one way, hopefully, for the industry to gather what best practices there may be in what beyond just having an interpreter. So, I mean, I agree. I think I tried to highlight that these are best practices, but not necessarily required by law. And if these best practices are instituted or implemented, then there's a much less likely chance that OCR will receive a complaint involving a certain provider. I don't know how else to answer that question.
Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Sure. There was some other question about how an individual knows if who a covered provider is. And I'm wondering if that is sort of wondering how you know if you're a covered entity or if you are a provider that must comply with these federal laws that require language interpreter services. And if you're an organization, if you're not sure if these laws apply to you, I would try to communicate with your legal department or anyone else in your organization who knows whether or not you all receive federal financial assistance from HHS. So again, if you're an organization that receives any grant money, so for example, a couple of other types of organizations that receive grant money from our department include federally qualified health centers and critical access hospitals. Those are also organizations that receive federal financial assistance from us. So they must also comply with the requirement to provide interpreter services. I should also mention too, if you're an organization that contracts with other entities, that your obligation to, as far as your legal obligation under Title VI and Section 1557, is to make sure that your subcontractors provide interpreter services where necessary, even if your subcontractors don't directly receive federal financial assistance from the Department of Health and Human Services. You, as a recipient of federal financial assistance, are obligated to make sure your subcontractors are still effectively communicating with your patients or your clients. So even though there may be a breakdown in interpreter service provision at your subcontractor levels, you're on the hook for making sure that those interpreter services are provided from your or through your subcontractors as well. So another question about whether it's any institution that receives federal funding that must comply. Again, if the federal funding is from our department, from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, then yes, you must comply. It may be that your organization receives federal financial assistance from a different federal department, such as the Department of Education or the Department of Labor or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. If that is the case, my Office for Civil Rights would not be able to, for example, work on a complaint or investigate a complaint about that organization because that organization's federal dollars did not come from the Department of Health and Human Services, but we would likely refer the complaint to the Office for Civil Rights or the equivalent of an Office for Civil Rights for them to investigate. Any other questions?
I have one, Ian. I have one about having a form available for the client if they choose to use a family member. If they sign a form saying they're waiving the right to have a free interpreter. I was just checking if that form would work if there was an investigation or that came up and they signed it and it's showing that they were offered that service.
Sure.
But they refused because they had a family member.
Sure. There is nothing in the laws that require interpreter services that prohibits that from being documented on a form. That documents the individual's waiving of the interpreter service in lieu of having a family member or some other companion interpret. That's perfectly fine. It's a fine way to document the fact that the provider offered the services, and that the patient or the individual or the companion, if the companion is the one who needed the services, that they declined them. Again, document. If that scenario is not captured on a form, for example, as your question asked, then the provider would really behoove itself or benefit itself if it documented that interaction in the patient's record or some other official place or space. So again, document. If you use a form to document the fact that a patient did not want the interpreter services offered, but instead wanted a companion to interpret, yes, the form is fine. And document, it would probably be a best practice to include that form in the patient's record or any other sort of document repository for that patient or that individual.
Okay, thanks.
So basically, in the way the federal government is organized, makes it very complicated to really understand all of the organizations that are required to meet Title VI compliance. There's not one central clearinghouse other than the Department of Justice, but it basically, if you're receiving any kind of federal funds or a subcontractor of federal funds, it's a fairly safe assumption to think that you should be meeting these requirements because it is across the board a requirement for the federal government. Uh-oh. You can unmute yourself, I think, Ian. Let's see. Is everybody else muted too?
We are all muted.
There you go.
Now everyone's unmuted.
Very nice echo. Okay. So in answer to your question, Cindy, yes, the Department of Justice is sort of the main federal organization that has jurisdiction over most Title VI type cases or complaints. Hello.
There we go.
That's much better. Okay. So Title VI compliance doesn't just fall on recipients of federal financial assistance. It also, other places of public accommodation must also comply with Title VI. When it comes to my office, again, our focus is fairly narrow in that it's only applicable to health care and human services offices or organizations that receive federal financial assistance from HHS. I would say that if anyone anywhere ever encounters any sort of a Title VI discrimination type of a situation, that they do the best they can to contact my office, even though I may not have jurisdiction over it. We would be able to refer that person to the right place where they could get an organization, another office for civil rights, or the Department of Justice to take a look at the complaint. Title VI compliance is fairly universal in the United States. It's just who has the authority to investigate that non-compliance is what's kind of complicated.
Cool, great, thank you. So yeah, I think that's where we run into trouble here is, how do we get the right information to the right entities, connect them, because it's so broad.
So you know how to turn your camera off too. You can turn it off down here. Oops.
It's okay. It's okay, Jill. All right.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. I get that. Again, if anyone in the United States ever feels like they've been discriminated against based on their race, wherever they are, or their national origin or their color, including their status as a LEP individual, then I encourage those people or advocates for those people to reach out to some federal Department of Office for Civil Rights. Even though we may not have jurisdiction over the specific entity that's doing the discriminating or the organization, we can hopefully point that person in the right direction.
Yeah, so I mean, we want to avoid it at all costs. We hope that we never have to report anything.
Exactly.
That's our goal. All right. Thanks, Ian.
Sure. Any other questions?
There's a comment on the chat from Allison Corbett. Do you want to check that, Ian?
Sure, I'm taking a look at it right now. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a great comment. Again, it kind of goes to the importance of having a language access plan. Again, it's not a legal requirement to have that plan, but in those policies and procedures that are sort of discussed in that context of a language access plan, it would be a great idea to have this sort of scenario addressed in there, right? Like, what is the organization's practice with respect to handling the situation where a patient comes in with a companion who may have the ability to speak in both English and the target language, but it is a best practice to not rely on that person, again, because there could be some consequences that are not thought of or thought about or considered at the time, and that they sort of choose this more convenient route over, again, what's best, what's right. I don't know what else to say other than it kind of has to come from top down, from the top down, from leadership in the organization about what is okay, what's not okay, and how their staff are supposed to handle those situations. So again, top down, I think it would be great if organizations had the resources and ability to identify a language access coordinator and just train all those staff that are in the organization who would encounter these situations so that they know what they're doing or what they should be doing, because we always want, of course, what's best for the patient, even though, and we also want what's best for the provider. And I would say, you know, just as a father of kids, what's most convenient is not necessarily the right answer. It's, you know, best to sort of, I don't want to say choose the harder right over the easier wrong, but that's kind of the phrase that comes to mind, I guess.
Well, it looks like we're at our time, and I'd like to thank you, Ian, for your great presentation, and thank the audience for their participation. And we do have an assessment. If you would please take a few minutes and do that. I put it in the chat. And so if you can click on that and take that evaluation, that helps us see how we're doing and if we can see some good things that we are doing. So if you can do that, that would be great. I think that's all we have. I will leave this evaluation up for another 10 minutes. So thank you all for attending, and especially you, Ian, for your time and your great expertise in this area. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, you all. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate their questions and your comments.
Thank you.